I'm delighted to have Paul McAnulty from Hope for Justice and Joy Gillespie from Survivors of Human Trafficking in Scotland on this Scotland Against Modern Slavery podcast. We're here to talk a little bit more about the Ukrainian crisis and the effect it's had in the UK and in Scotland, but the effect it's had on those Ukrainians that have come to this country. I think the first thing I'd say before I welcome Joy and Paul is that I'm deeply concerned about the risk of exploitation of those people that are coming. They have the right to work from day one. Many businesses have many gaps, as we know, as we go through the challenges in the labour market. And some may see that as a simple filling the gap situation, but there's a lot more complexities behind it. And we're seeing that on the ground in Scotland, and in the UK as well. So that's why I've invited these two guests. So Paul and Joy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi.
So, can I just open with you, Paul, because I know in your role that you have with Hope for Justice, you've had a lot of exposure. There was a report run of the number of Ukrainians that had arrived had been surveyed. Can you talk to me about what your role is and a little bit more about that survey and what that meant?
Yeah, of course. So UK and Europe Programme Director for Hope for Justice, and we are fundamentally an anti-slavery, anti-trafficking organisation. When the invasion of Ukraine first hit, we promptly realised that there's an obligation here for organisations in our sector, but also the humanitarian sector, to respond quickly in order to prevent Europe's biggest humanitarian crisis since the Second World War from becoming Europe's biggest human trafficking crisis. And we could only do that by a collective response, so circulating preventative messages, letting people know what the risks of exploitation are in transit and in destination countries, and then hopefully sort of galvanising them with the information they need in order to be able to access all kinds of support services available to them in the appropriate languages, and then distributing them in a sort of proactive digital and physical way so that we could make sure that people en route out of Ukraine were being given the appropriate resources. So,
okay. And can I ask, from a size and scale of what you see about numbers of people, Ukrainian nationals, first of all in the UK, what are you seeing on the ground?
So on the ground, obviously there's over 10 million people being displaced from Ukraine by the conflict. A huge percentage of those are female and children, due to martial law and the fact that many males of fighting age have stayed behind. So it's easy to see that from that the risk of exploitation against violence against women and children, sexual violence, sexual exploitation, and domestic servitude is a real threat. I think the preventative campaign reached over 4 million people in total through the collective response of every organisation involved. But what we're seeing in the UK is that the positive side of things is that the UK government has opened up all kinds of concessions, visas, schemes, that are helping people displaced by the conflict. I don't want to refer to them as refugees because they haven't been given official refugee status. So I don't want to conflate those two terms, but those that have been displaced by the Ukraine crisis have been afforded a certain number of concessions through various schemes and visas. But with those, the fast tracking of those has also sort of perpetuated this environment where exploitation can flourish, and safeguarding due diligence isn't as robust as perhaps it could be, and we're already experiencing and encountering reports of exploitation within various schemes.
So, let's talk about those schemes, and Joy, maybe bring you in a bit here, because I know in Scotland it's slightly different, isn't it? So we have 3 schemes. Keep me right here. There's 3 schemes for Ukrainians, Joy, is that right?
I think there's maybe more than that.
Right. Paul
will know the details. So there's the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which is the UK government scheme. In Scotland, we have the Super Sponsor scheme, which is the Scottish response to the crisis and for displaced people to come here. However, they can come under any of the other schemes. So there's a family extension scheme as well. There's an extension for people that have been were already here in the labour market. And so there's a number of other schemes. Those schemes in Scotland are a lot smaller in percentage. The majority of people that have come to Scotland that we know of anyway at the moment are through the Super Sponsor scheme, which is the Scottish Government scheme to welcome displaced Ukrainians. So that and there's about 16,500 people in Scotland at the moment under those schemes, but the biggest percentage of them are from the super sponsor scheme. That's our estimate about how many people are in the country, because the super sponsor scheme were able to track quite well who's here, because the Scottish Government accommodated them immediately that they arrive. However, people may be arriving under those other schemes, can come into the country without having registered as having arrived, so that presents a bit of a risk. So that smaller group of people that are arriving are probably more at risk immediately of some form of exploitation and are more difficult to track.
Well, that kind of makes me think, because what I've seen, I'm when the crisis started to unfold and the Homes for Ukrainian scheme opened up, you can see there's a number of Facebook groups that effectively have become a personal matching service. And at first glance, it scared the living daylights out of me. And you can go on, and I know what people have, people in the UK, out of the goodness of their hearts, have said, come and I'll house you. But there's some badness out there, there's some evilness out there, and you can see that just in the Facebook group, and you can see that sometimes there's females putting their picture on, they're in Ukraine, or they're in other European nations and want to come here, saying where they want to come, and you can see some of the comments coming from males about what they look like and all that type of thing. Paul, is this something, we touched on the survey earlier on, what are you seeing then from the results of that?
It is sadly, yes, Shan. So the risks under the official schemes are quite severe, but then there's an enhanced risk of unofficial matching services just becoming a breeding ground for sexual exploitation. What we're seeing, so I think in England, compared to Scotland, there's disproportionately high number of people housed under the Homes for Ukraine scheme. So 121,000 currently. Initially, hosts were asked to host people for 6 months. And the hope is that those placements would be extended. Now, we've had reports of sexual exploitation against guests at the hands of their hosts. There doesn't seem to be a huge element of organised criminality involved in this. A lot of it seems to be opportunistic and for personal gratification. But these people are being put in incredibly risky situations. And what we're finding is that the Department of Levelling Up and the local government authority have done a great job of trying to provide local authorities with the right kind of guidance on due diligence, safeguarding, and how to do welfare checks and suitability checks on the houses themselves. But what we're finding is they're under-resourced. So if a host makes themselves unavailable for a welfare check, nobody follows up on that. So those that are currently trapped in exploitation might never be found, because the only cases we're having reported to us of pretty serious sexual exploitation are being reported by the survivors themselves after they've removed themselves from the placement. And now the scheme, the Homes for Ukraine scheme specifically, it's hitting its 6-month sort of milestone. That was 2 weeks ago. And what we're told is that there's several hundred people due to face homelessness or destitution now. In October and November, that number is likely to rise to 40 and then 80,000 people whose placements will be coming to an end. I think the move on plan for that is to ask hosts to extend for another 6 months, and it keeping people in this state of flux just seems to be a huge risk factor. So we've interviewed Ukrainians, and they're educated people with 1, 2, sometimes 3 degrees. They're well experienced. They have incredible skills, but what they're saying is that they have a very low success rate when it comes to trying to find employment. Mm-hmm. Now, 1 in 10 of them have been threatened with homelessness by their hosts. 1 in 3 have said they can't find work, and 1 in 2 don't have any money or savings to fall back on. So that makes entry into a private rental market that is quite aggressive at the moment near on impossible. So they're very much at the mercy of these various schemes, and the barriers to access to employability are proving a sort of exacerbating factor to their vulnerability at the moment. So.
And interesting you see that in some of those stats, Joy. I mean, is that to me, some of those stats, just what they're highlighting is vulnerability. A threat of homelessness, can't get work.
Yeah,
And
and that's reflected in Scotland as well, you know, exactly what Paul's seeing in England in terms of these hosting arrangements coming to an end after 6 months, and people, you know, lots of well-meaning people, but they didn't sign, they signed up for something. And, you know, after 6 months, that, you know, there's only so much that maybe a family can take on, and not an extended amount, especially living with people who are actually living through trauma. They've not just experienced trauma, their country is still at war, their families are still, many of them still in the country. So that's playing out in people's homes as they try to live their ordinary family life. So there's strains of that kind that asking people to extend for a longer period sometimes is just not possible. And so people, these displaced Ukrainians are, you know, coming to the end of their 6-month period and are in this vulnerable situation of finding themselves potentially destitute. We know in Scotland we've already got a housing crisis. You know, it's very difficult to find housing. It may well be that causes people who are in a vulnerable, Ukrainians that are in an exploitative situation, it almost gives them no choice, because there's no real option for them apart from becoming homeless. And what does that mean? I guess that the other thing is that we've got large numbers of people living in groups as well. So this is different from the English situation, in that the Scottish Government, to try and mitigate some of the risks that we've discussed around exploitative hosts, the Scottish Government have tried to mitigate that by housing everyone and giving them emergency accommodation in hotels or such like, temporary accommodation, until they make the matches and they do the safeguarding checks. But logistically, that is a massive task to undertake. And so that process has been very slow. And people are then accommodated in groups for a long time. And we know that anyone that works in anti-trafficking knows that there's risks associated with that as well, where you've got vulnerable people living in large groups together. It's also a ground where it's, you know, fortuitous for perpetrators to recruit, or opportunists to recruit. And the other thing that we know is that the Ukrainians, who are remarkable people, I mean, we've all met with Ukrainians, worked beside them, and I mean, I don't know, there's not words to describe their resilience and their courage and all of that. But on top of that, they're really keen to work.
mm-hmm.
You know, they're really keen to fend for themselves, to, you know, establish themselves here, even if it is on a temporary basis. That drive actually makes them vulnerable as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're so keen to work that they perhaps will take up employment that is in that fight, and also with the knowledge that if they don't bring in an income, what's going to happen to them in 6 months' time? What's going to happen to them, as Paul says, that these hosting schemes, some of them are coming to an end. You know, they need to have that financial ability to maybe take up a private rent if that's possible, and we all know how difficult that is at the moment. But it does put them at risk, either of employers who are providing accommodation with associated with the job, or people that are not going to pay them well, or whatever. So they're at risk because there's so many layers of vulnerability for these people. Yeah.
I can see I mean, you know, what we're looking at applications into Scotland, and it's, you know, around 30,000, you know, so we've still got a long way to go as well, with people that could still be arriving, Joy.
Well, we've got, I think the last data that I saw, there was almost 35,000 people that had been issued visas to come to Scotland. So, and as I said, we've got about 16,500 here at the moment. The super sponsor scheme has been paused by the Scottish Government because we really at capacity, and they are encouraging people not to come to Scotland because they don't have space to accommodate them in these temporary spaces, which also puts people at risk in another way. People that are already travelling or already made their journey, have already made their visa application. That's a different conversation probably for another day. But if we think that we have 16,500 people here already, potentially another around 35,000 people to come, and the demographic of them, those people changing as they come through. So there has been predominantly females until now. The age of demographic of people that have visas and haven't come yet, increasing numbers of males within working age groups as well. So, about, over 30% of the ones that have visas that have not arrived yet are working age males. So, there's the risk of sexual exploitation and domestic servitude for everyone, not just the males, and those kind of very hidden forms of exploitation, but increasing concerns about labour exploitation, which we know, as you have said, that there's big gaps in our labour market, and the easiest thing in the world is to see there's people that are desperate to work and there's gaps in the labour market, and those two things coming together could be really a wonderful marry, if you like, but equally they could be a really exploitative one as well.
And Paul, I mean, I've seen this myself, and I know there's anecdotal evidence of something's going on already. You have the ship that's docked in Edinburgh, we have a ship in Glasgow now, the hotels that are dotted around Scotland. Are you seeing this from a UK perspective as well, Paul, from a exploitation perspective? Do you see this?
We are not so much in the hotels accommodation or large scale accommodation, but definitely in unlicensed houses of multiple occupancy, or houses of multiple occupancy that are over occupancy. All the places you would historically expect to see precursors to labour exploitation. So yeah, unlicensed HMOs, overcrowded accommodation in the private rented space. Yeah, we're definitely seeing the Ukrainian sort of community within the UK is definitely kind of woven now into the fabric of where we would expect to find exploitation in other communities and other cohorts of victim as well. I think, yeah, Joe just did a great job of kind of summarising it. We're almost in a perfect storm in the UK at the moment. So I think it was Brexit that threw us into the biggest labour shortage since 1997. And now we have an influx of people that are work ready, and not just work ready, but work hungry. And it just seems an unfair journey for someone to experience. So if you've managed to avoid, death in the first instance during the invasion, if you've managed to avoid exploitation or kidnap at any of the borders crossings, and if you've managed to avoid exploitation on nexus points to any of the countries that are synonymous with corruption or exploitation, places like Moldova, Romania, on the border of Ukraine, if you've managed to make it this far through tenacity, luck, perseverance, sheer will, it just seems really unfair to me that you can be exploited once you arrive here in the UK, and that the solution is a relatively simple one. Lowering the barriers to employment and just helping people towards long-term sustainable independence rather than keeping them in a state of flux, because we know that a lot of the schemes afford people the right to remain in the UK for 3 years. So if they have that wiggle room, was the expectation for hosts to just keep renewing every 6 months for 3 years, or was there a plan for people to actually become part of our community in the UK? And I think that's a question that in certain sort of ministries need to really sort of ask themselves and try to come up with a better plan for, really.
Okay, so it's like I think you touched on that term there, Paul, it's a perfect storm, and this is what concerns me, and from a Scotland perspective, and the UK obviously, but we've been running sessions, as you guys know about red flags and what to spot, and there's probably a little bit more. There's a lot more to be considered when employing or taking on Ukrainians, be that through a recruitment agency or directly. And we've been working at SAMS on what we call the pledge to support those that are looking for work. As you mentioned earlier on, the level of English has not been great. The level of qualifications tends to be a lot higher. And it's that willingness to work. And what we can then do to support, to give back to that community, to support them with English, to support them with work for as little as long as they need, and get them into the society, I suppose, and out of that type of environment, and to understand what good work actually is, because again, that's what I feel is a risk. Excuse me. And Paul, you'd mentioned about the refugee, the status of a refugee. They're not classed as refugees. They have day one rights to work as well. So it's trying to educate the employment sector that there's some safeguarding that needs to be considered, rather than just saying we've got gaps, let's just fill them with them, because that's when the risks are going to be exploited. Well, we've had a good chat, Joy and Paul, and I'm really thankful that you did. And this follows on from one of our roundtables that we had last week, which the feedback had been phenomenal. So you guys had done a great job, and on that roundtable we had two Ukrainian nationals that spoke about their journey and a really personal side to all of this. And unfortunately, they couldn't join us today, but if anybody wants some more information, you'll see that in the SAM's website and the social media channels, there's information on their stories. So, Paul McAnulty, Programme Director at Hope for Justice, please keep up the good work. And Joy Gillespie, Survivors of Human Trafficking in Scotland, Chief Exec. Again, knowing you both so well and being part of this journey that we've been on here at SAM's, can only thank you for your support, but actually your passion, which just comes through from talking to you, but actually doing the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thanks.